Hello, this presentation is intended for students taking Anatomy and Physiology 2 with Gina Piscatelli at Madison Area Technical College. Please refer to study questions, your syllabus for study questions and assigned readings. In this presentation, I will discuss the events that occur during one cardiac cycle and describe how valve dysfunction disrupts some of these events. The term cardiac cycle refers to the sequence of events that occur during a specific time period of heart function. It begins when both atria contract and ends when both the ventricles and the atria are relaxed. However, the cardiac cycle is, as its name implies, a cycle, and so the beginning or the end is an arbitrary time point. There are many mechanical events that occur during one cardiac cycle. These include the sequence in which the heart chambers contract and relax, changes in blood pressure, and the opening and closing of heart valves. All of these events affect optimal functioning of the heart, and I will discuss each of the three in this order. The first mechanical event is the order in which the heart chambers contract and relax. A cardiac cycle begins with blood filling the ventricles. During the first phase, shown in the blue box and labeled number 1, the atria are receiving blood, which flows passively into the ventricles. Both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed during this time. Phase 2 begins at the end of ventricular filling, with both atria contracting to actively push blood into the ventricles. This is shown in the green box labeled number 2. During this time, the ventricles remain relaxed. In the third phase, both atria relax and the ventricles begin to contract. This is shown in the yellow box labeled number 3. During this time, ventricular contraction has not yet created enough force to actively move blood out of the ventricles. However, pressure is increasing with time. As blood pushes against the AV valves, these valves close. Number 4, the orange box, depicts the end of ventricular contraction when pressure and tension are high enough to eject blood from the ventricles. During this time, the atria remain relaxed. At the end of one cardiac cycle, labeled number 5 and shown in the purple box, both ventricles relax and both atria remain relaxed. There are some specific terms we use to refer to contraction or relaxation of a heart chamber. The first term is systole, which means the period in which the chamber contracts. When the atria contract, they are in atrial systole. When the ventricles contract, they are in ventricular systole. The second term is diastole, which means chamber relaxation. When the atria relax, they are in atrial diastole. When the ventricles relax, they are in ventricular diastole. On this slide, the first picture on the left, diagram 1, depicts a point in the cardiac cycle when atrial systole and ventricular diastole occur at the same time. Diagram 2 shows atrial diastole and ventricular systole. And diagram number 3 shows atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. Please note that the term systole does not always mean that blood will be ejected from a chamber. Even if the chamber is in systole, blood will not move unless there is a force great enough to overcome any sort of resistance. Let's review the sequence in which the chambers contract and relax using the appropriate terms. Diagram 1 shows the first phase of atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. Note that during this time blood flows from the atria into the ventricles even though the atria are not contracting. This will be explained later. Diagram 2 shows the second phase in which the atria enter systole and the ventricles are in diastole. Blood flow does occur during this time. Number 3 depicts the beginning of atrial diastole, so the atria are relaxing, and the beginning of ventricular systole. Note that during this time blood does not eject from the ventricles. In number 4, the orange box shows that the continuation of atrial diastole and ventricular systole will produce blood ejection from the ventricles. And lastly, number 5 in the purple box, all chambers relax, all chambers enter diastole, so both atrial diastole and ventricular diastole occur simultaneously. During this time, blood is returning to the heart and the atria will fill with blood. In summary, notice that the ventricles fill during two phases, during both atrial diastole and atrial systole, or phase 1 and phase 2. Also notice that the ventricular ejection only occurs during the end of ventricular systole, that is part of ventricular systole, number 4. So ventricular diastole allows the filling of the ventricles. Ventricular systole does not always produce blood ejection, only at the very end. The general concepts about the cardiac cycle are that diastole corresponds to a period of relaxation during which a chamber is filling with blood, not ejecting blood. And a general concept is also that systole corresponds to a period of contraction during which blood is ejected from a chamber. However, there are 2 points during the cardiac cycle in which these two generalizations do not adequately describe the flow of blood during the cardiac cycle. These tricky parts are, 1, first, that atrial systole is not required for blood to leave the atria and enter the ventricles. In fact, 80% of ventricular filling occurs while the atria are in diastole. The second tricky part is that at the beginning of ventricular systole, blood is not ejected from the ventricles. Only at the end of ventricular systole do we see blood movement. So it is more accurate to say that diastole corresponds to a period of relaxation during which the chamber fills with blood, but blood may also passively leave the chamber. And secondly, that systole corresponds to a period of contraction during which muscle tension develops to eventually cause the chamber to eject blood. The movement of blood out of the atria while they are in diastole, as well as the lack of blood movement out of the ventricles while they are in systole, can be explained by looking at the forces that actually cause blood to flow. Primarily, the force that causes blood to flow is a gradient of pressure. The diagram that you're looking at on the slide depicts many different events that are occurring during one cardiac cycle. The red line indicates electrical activity. The orange line indicates how pressure in the aorta changes. The blue line depicts how pressure in the ventricle changes. The pink line shows how pressure in the atria changes. And then finally that black line shows the volume of blood in a ventricle. You may notice all the way down at the bottom there are some small words S1 and S2. Those refer to heart sounds. And then finally in the boxes below you see what phase or period each chamber is in, diastole or systole. We will use this diagram in lab a little later. For now, we're interested in how blood flows due to a pressure gradient. And blood flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, much in the way that diffusion occurs, from high to low. The passive filling of the ventricle during atrial diastole, shown in the blue box, occurs because the pressure in the atrium is initially zero, but rises above this while the pressure in the ventricle remains low. So pressure in the atrium rises above zero, but the pressure in the ventricle remains lower. That causes blood to move from the atrium to the ventricle. Active filling of the ventricle during atrial systole, shown in the green box, occurs as pressure in the atria reaches a maximum of 15 millimeters of mercury, which is higher than the pressure in the ventricles. At the beginning of ventricular systole, shown in the yellow box, pressure in the ventricle builds with a low range between 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury. And at this time the blood pressure in the aorta, as well as the pulmonary trunk, is much higher than that. So aortic pressure is approximately 80 millimeters of mercury at this time. Therefore, blood will not move from the low pressure in the ventricle of 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury to the high pressure in the aorta. But at the end of ventricular systole, shown in the orange box, the pressure builds, as I mentioned, and reaches a maximum pressure in the ventricle of 120 millimeters of mercury, which overcomes the lower pressure in the aorta, and blood moves from the ventricles into the aorta. The same happens on the right side of the heart, and blood will move into the pulmonary trunk. This slide summarizes the pressure gradients that exist during one cardiac cycle. In 1A and B, the blue box, during atrial diastole, the ventricle is also relaxed. Blood moves from the atrium to the ventricle because pressure in the atrium is higher than in the ventricle, which is denoted with the P subatrium being greater than P subventricle. In 1C, the green box, atrial systole is occurring, but the ventricle is still in diastole. Blood continues to move from the atrium to the ventricle because the pressure in the atrium is higher than the pressure in the ventricle. In number 2, the yellow box, when ventricular systole begins, pressure in the ventricle builds and is higher than pressure in the atrium. So if possible, blood would move from the ventricle into the atrium. However, it does not do so because the AV valves are pressed closed by the blood pressure. So they close, the AV valves close. Also, blood does not move from the ventricle into a great artery because the pressure in the arteries is higher than the pressure in the ventricles. At the end of ventricular systole, shown as the orange box, finally blood ejection occurs. During this time, pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the arteries. The AV valves are still closed, so blood cannot backflow into the low pressure atrium. At the beginning of ventricular diastole, the atria are still in diastole. This is shown in the purple box. No blood flows into the ventricles yet because the pressure in the atria is not high enough. Recall that valves do not cause the movement of blood, but they dictate the direction that blood will flow in the heart. They open passively due to the rise in blood pressure. The picture on this slide is a superior view of the heart with both atria removed. Notice that the bicuspid valve and tricuspid valve are both open. This tells us that blood pressure in the atria is higher than blood pressure in the ventricles. Also notice that the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve are both closed. This tells us that blood pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk is still higher than the blood pressure in the ventricles. Therefore, the end of ventricular systole, when blood would be ejected, has not yet occurred. Now let's look at the points during the cardiac cycle when the valves are open and closed. As expected, the AV valves are open when the ventricles are filling. This occurs during atrial diastole and during atrial systole, shown in the blue and the green box. The AV valves first close when ventricular systole begins, shown in the yellow box. At all other points during the cardiac cycle, the AV valves will remain closed. That is, throughout all of ventricular systole, and also at the point when both the ventricles and both the atria are relaxed, shown in the purple box, the AV valves are closed. This is due to the fact that blood pressure in the atria is still too low to force the valves open. The semilunar valves open at the end of ventricular systole when blood is ejected into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. These valves will close when the ventricles begin to relax to prevent the backflow of blood into the ventricles. The semilunar valves remain closed for the rest of the cardiac cycle. So the AV valves are open during two phases, during atrial diastole and atrial systole. The semilunar valves are open only at the end of ventricular systole. Heart function can be assessed in part by listening to the sounds of the heart during the heartbeat or during the cardiac cycle. The sounds that you hear, the familiar lub-dub, 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 are associated with the closing of the two sets of heart valves. So the closing rather than the opening causes the sound. There is some debate in the literature what actually causes the noise, but it is most commonly agreed that what we hear is a result of valve movement and the turbulence of blood flow. The first heart sound that we hear, the lub, is when the AV valves close. It is known as S1, and it occurs when the ventricles begin systole. The second heart sound we hear, the dup, is when the semilunar valves close. This is when the ventricles first begin or enter diastole and relax just after they have ejected blood. This second sound is known as S2. This diagram depicts when in the cardiac cycle the two heart sounds can be heard. The first sound is referred to as S1, and on the diagram you can see that it occurs at the beginning of ventricular systole, or the yellow box, as the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve close. The second sound, referred to as S2, occurs when the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve close at the start of ventricular diastole. This is shown in the purple box and occurs right after ventricular ejection. Any unusual or abnormal heart sounds are referred to as heart murmurs. Heart murmurs occur when blood flow is excessively turbulent, as occurs when it flows against any obstruction. Usually a heart murmur indicates a problem with a heart valve, but sometimes a heart murmur can actually be normal, such as in young children whose heart walls are thinner than adults and therefore vibrate more. A cardiologist could distinguish a true heart murmur from one of these more normal murmurs. There are two categories of disorders related to valve function that cause heart murmurs. At least two categories that are the most common. One category is valvular insufficiency or incompetence. The other category is valvular stenosis. They can be distinguished from each other by two factors. One, by the different sounds that they cause, and two, by how the valve actually malfunctions. In one case, the valve doesn't close properly, and in the other case, the valve doesn't open properly. In valvular insufficiency, a valve fails to close properly. This partially closed or partially open valve, even though it's supposed to be closed, will allow blood to flow backwards or regurgitate into the wrong chamber. It causes a sound known as swishing, a swishing sound. An example of valvular insufficiency is valvular prolapse, which I'll show you on the next slide. The other category, valvular stenosis, occurs when a valve fails to open properly. The partially open valve is constricted. It doesn't open completely. And the blood flow is restricted, and as the blood flows through the valve, it makes a clicking sound. Here are examples of the two types or categories of valve disorders. On the left, the diagram shows the bicuspid valve is flapping into the left atrium when the ventricle contracts. This causes regurgitation of blood into the left atrium. The valve is said to be prolapsed. Prolapse occurs when the valve does not close properly and is categorized then as an insufficient valve disorder, and a swishing noise would be heard on exam. On the right, the diagram shows two valves, the aortic semilunar valve and the bicuspid valve, both with calcium deposits on their surface. These deposits cause the valves to become stiff and they cannot open freely any longer. This is an example of valvular stenosis, and when the valves do open, blood flows through, but since the opening is narrow, it makes a clicking sound as it passes through the stenotic stiff valves. It makes forward flow very difficult. That is the end of this presentation. Thank you.